The wind in Oklahoma Territory carried more than dust in the autumn of 1897. It carried whispers. It carried the smell of red earth, turned fresh by plow and spade. It carried the prayers of settlers who believed that faith and hard work could transform this vast expanse into something resembling home. But the wind also carried things that should have stayed buried, things that should have remained unspoken. And on certain nights, when the moon hung low and swollen over the prairie, the wind carried the sound of a woman singing, a wedding song, slow and tuneless and wrong. Her name was Eleanor Briggs, though by the time the story reached its end, most folks in Guthrie County simply called her the widow, not out of respect, out of something closer to fear, out of the kind of silence that settles over a community when they realize that one of their own has crossed a line that even God himself might hesitate to forgive. But to understand what Eleanor became, you must first understand what she was and what she lost. There are places in this world where the veil between what is and what should not be grows thin. Oklahoma Territory in the last years of the 19th century was one such place. It was a land in transition, a land caught between the old ways and the new, between the wild and the tamed, between the sacred and the profane. The native peoples who had been forced onto this land carried with them stories of spirits and warnings. They spoke of places where the earth itself was wounded, where the dead walked, where the living could become lost in ways that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the soul. The settlers who came after did not believe these stories, or if they did, they believed that their faith, their civilization, their sheer determination could push back the darkness. They built churches. They sang hymns. They plowed the red earth and planted crops and raised children and told themselves that they were bringing light to the wilderness. But the wilderness has a way of pushing back, of seeping into the cracks, of finding the weak places in the human heart and exploiting them. Eleanor Briggs was one such weak place, not weak in the sense of frail or cowardly, weak in the sense of open, vulnerable. She had a heart that felt things too deeply, that could not let go, that clung to love with a desperation that bordered on the pathological. And when that love was taken from her, when Samuel died and left her alone in that vast, indifferent prairie, something inside her tore, not cleanly, not mercifully, but slowly, like fabric pulled at the seams until the threads give way, one by one. Oklahoma in those days was not yet a state. It was territory, raw and unfinished and brutal in its honesty. The land stretched out in all directions, flat and red and unforgiving, broken only by the occasional stand of cottonwoods near a creek bed, or the dark outline of a homestead against the horizon. The sky was bigger here than anywhere else in the world, or so it seemed to those who came seeking a new start. That bigness could inspire you, or it could crush you. It depended on what you carried inside. Eleanor had come to Oklahoma with her husband Samuel in the spring of 1895. They were young. She was 22. He was 26. They had married in Missouri, in a small church with white walls and narrow windows that let in shafts of golden light. Eleanor had worn a dress her mother made, cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Simple, but beautiful. She had felt beautiful that day. Samuel had looked at her like she was the only thing in the world worth looking at. And when he took her hand at the altar, his palm was warm and rough from work, and she thought to herself that she would hold that hand for the rest of her life. They took a claim south of Guthrie, near the Cimarron River, 160 acres of red dirt and scrub grass and hope. Samuel built them a house, one room at first, then two, sod walls and a tar paper roof, a stone fireplace that smoked when the wind blew wrong, a table he made from scrap lumber, 2 chairs, a bed frame with a mattress stuffed with prairie grass. It was not much, but it was theirs, and Eleanor filled it with what love she could gather. She planted wildflowers in tin cans by the door. She sewed curtains from feed sacks. She cooked beans and cornbread and salt pork on a wood stove that never held heat right. And at night, when the work was done, she and Samuel would sit outside on the steps and watch the sun bleed out across the horizon, and he would rest his hand on her knee, and she would lean into him, and the world felt small enough to hold. Samuel was a good man. Everyone said so. He worked hard. He did not drink. He did not curse. He went to church on Sundays when they could make the trip into town. He was quiet, but not unkind. He had broad shoulders and strong hands, and a way of looking at a problem until it made sense. He loved Eleanor in the way men of that time and place loved their wives, steadily, practically, without a lot of words. But she knew. She knew by the way he fixed the roof before winter came, by the way he brought her wildflowers sometimes for no reason, by the way he would stand at the window in the mornings and watch her moving about the kitchen, and his face would soften in a way it never did for anyone else. They were happy, not in any loud or remarkable way, but in the quiet, durable way that most happiness actually is. They had plans. They wanted children. They wanted to expand the house. They wanted to plant an orchard. They wanted to grow old together on that piece of red earth and be buried side by side when the time came. Simple dreams, the kind that should have been enough. Eleanor kept a journal in those early years, a small leather-bound book that Samuel had given her as a wedding gift. In it, she wrote about their daily life with a detail that suggests she was trying to preserve every moment, as if some part of her already knew that happiness was fleeting. She wrote about the morning Samuel brought her wildflowers, yellow ones. She did not know their name, but they smelled like honey and sunshine. She wrote about the evening they sat outside and watched a storm roll across the prairie, the sky turning green and purple, the wind howling, and how they had held hands and not been afraid because they were together. She wrote about the night she told him she thought she might be with child, though it turned out to be false hope, and how he had held her while she cried and told her there was time, that they had all the time in the world. But they did not have all the time in the world. No one does. And Eleanor, who had written so carefully about every small joy, would later fill those same pages with something else entirely, with plans, with measurements, with notes about salt content and tanning processes and the best type of thread for stitching human skin. The journal still exists, locked away in a private collection. Few have seen it. Fewer still have read it all the way through, because what starts as a record of love becomes, page by page, a manual for desecration. And the handwriting, which begins neat and careful, grows increasingly erratic as the entries progress, until by the end it is barely legible, the words pressed so hard into the paper that they tear through in places. But that was later. In those early days, Eleanor was simply a young woman in love. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental oven. She learned to recognize the signs of weather changes by watching the sky. She learned to patch Samuel's work clothes, and to render lard, and to make soap from ash and fat. She learned the 1,000 small skills that pioneer women needed to survive, and Samuel learned too. He learned to read the land, to know when to plant and when to wait, to fix what broke and to build what they needed. He learned to be gentle with Eleanor when she was tired or sad. He learned that sometimes silence was better than words. He learned to love her not just in the grand, dramatic way of poetry and songs, but in the practical, everyday way that actually matters. Their neighbors, The few that there were said they were a good match, that they fit together, that you could see it in the way they moved around each other, synchronized without even trying. At church socials, they would stand close but not touching, a respectable distance, but there was something in their proximity that suggested connection. When Samuel spoke, Eleanor would listen with her whole attention, her eyes on his face, a small smile at the corners of her mouth. When Eleanor laughed, which was not often but was genuine when it came, Samuel would watch her with an expression that could only be described as wonder, as if he could not quite believe his good fortune. They were building a life, slowly, carefully, one day at a time. And if there were hardships, and there were many, they faced them together. The year the crops failed, and they had to live on cornmeal and rabbits Samuel trapped. The winter the roof leaked, and they had to huddle by the fire to stay warm. The endless grinding work that never seemed to result in much progress. The isolation that could press down on you like a physical weight, making you forget sometimes that there was a world beyond the prairie. They endured it all because they had each other, and that, they believed, was enough. But the land does not care about your dreams, and neither does death. It happened in late August of 1897. The heat that summer had been relentless, the kind of heat that cracked the earth and dried up creek beds, and made even the insects go quiet. Samuel had been working on a section of fence along the northern boundary of their claim. The posts needed replacing, the wire needed tightening. It was hot work, brutal work, but it needed doing. Eleanor had packed him a lunch, bread and cheese and a jar of water. She had kissed him on the cheek before he left. He had smiled at her, that small, soft smile he saved just for her. And then he walked out into the shimmering heat, and she did not see him alive again. They said it was heat stroke. The doctor from Guthrie, a thin man with spectacles and a voice like rustling paper, came out to examine the body. He said Samuel's heart had likely given out, that the heat had been too much, that these things happened, that there was nothing anyone could have done. Eleanor listened to these words from a great distance, as if she were underwater, and the doctor was speaking from the surface. She nodded, she thanked him, and then she asked him to leave. The funeral was held 3 days later. Samuel was buried in the small cemetery on the edge of town, in a plot next to the graves of other settlers who had not made it. The preacher said the usual things about dust and ashes and the kingdom of heaven. The handful of neighbors who attended stood sweating in their Sunday clothes and sang a hymn that sounded thin and lost in the vastness of the prairie. Eleanor stood at the graveside and did not cry. She stood very still, her hands folded in front of her, her face pale and expressionless, like something carved from wax. People thought she was in shock. They thought grief had made her numb. They told her it would get easier. They told her time would heal. They brought her casseroles and bread and offers of help, and then they went back to their own lives, because that is what people do. Eleanor returned to the little sod house alone. She walked through the door and closed it behind her, and stood in the dim, cool interior, and the silence was so complete, it felt like a living thing. She looked at the table where they used to eat, at the bed where they used to sleep, at the chair where Samuel used to sit and whittle pieces of wood into shapes that never quite became anything. And she felt something crack inside her. Not break, not yet, but crack, like ice under too much weight. That night, she did not sleep. She sat in Samuel's chair and stared at the wall and listened to the wind outside. And sometime before dawn, a thought came to her. Not a thought, exactly. More like a need, a certainty. She would not let him go. She could not. He was hers. He had always been hers. And death was just another kind of distance, just another problem that could be solved if you were willing to work hard enough. At first it was small things. She kept his clothes. She refused to let anyone take them. She hung his shirt on the back of the door where he used to hang it. She set a plate for him at meals. She spoke to him as if he were still there, in the room, listening. The neighbors noticed. They said she was grieving. They said she needed time. But time passed, and Eleanor did not get better. If anything, she got worse. She stopped coming to church. She stopped answering the door when people knocked. She stopped going into town. She became a figure glimpsed only at a distance, a shape moving behind the window, a shadow. Then came the first exhumation. It happened a month after the burial. Eleanor went to the cemetery in the middle of the night, when the moon was dark and the world was as black as the inside of a coffin. She brought a shovel. She dug. The earth was hard and dry, but she was strong with purpose, and by dawn she had reached the pine box they had buried Samuel in. She pried it open, and she looked at him. He had changed. Of course he had. Death changes everything. His skin had begun to gray and tighten. His eyes had sunken. His lips had pulled back from his teeth in a way that made him look like he was grimacing. But to Eleanor, he was still Samuel, still hers. She reached into the coffin and touched his face. His skin was cold and leathery and stiff, but it was his skin. And she remembered. She remembered the day they were married, the way he had looked at her, the way his hand had felt in hers, the way she had promised, before God and witnesses, to be his wife until death parted them. But death had parted them, and she had not been ready. She would never be ready. And so she made a different promise, a promise that no one else heard, a promise that should never have been made. She would keep him. She would bring him back, not in body, perhaps, but in a way that mattered, in a way that meant something. She would remake their wedding day. She would wear him. She would carry him with her, always. And they would never be parted again. The idea took root, slowly, like a weed, pushing up through cracks in stone. At first, she only took small pieces, a patch of skin from his forearm, where the sleeve of his shirt would have covered it, a strip from his back. She told herself she was preserving him, honoring him. She wrapped the pieces in cloth and brought them home and laid them out on the table in the dim light of the kerosene lamp, and she looked at them for a long time. And then she began to work. Eleanor had always been skilled with a needle. Her mother had taught her to sew when she was a girl. She could mend. She could embroider. She could take a piece of fabric and turn it into something useful and beautiful. But this was different. This required precision, patience, a steady hand, and a will that did not falter. She treated the skin with salt and alum, the way you would treat leather. She stretched it. She dried it. And when it was ready, she began to cut. She worked at night mostly, when the world outside was dark and still, and no one would come knocking. She lit candles. She sat at the table with Samuel's skin spread before her like fabric from a bolt, and she cut patterns, sleeves, bodice panels, hem pieces. She measured twice. She cut once, and slowly, over weeks and then months, the dress began to take shape. It was not easy. Skin is not like cloth. It is thicker, more resistant. It does not hold a stitch the way cotton or wool does. But Eleanor was determined. She used waxed thread. She used a heavy needle meant for leather work. She sewed slowly, carefully, pulling each stitch tight. And as she worked, she sang the same hymn they had sung at their wedding. Her voice was soft and tuneless and barely more than a whisper, but she sang it over and over, like a prayer, like an incantation. The preservation process had been the hardest part to learn. Eleanor had no training in taxidermy or tanning. She had only instinct and desperation, and a few half-remembered conversations with an old trapper she had met once in Guthrie, who had talked about preserving hides. She experimented. She failed. The first pieces she took from Samuel's body did not keep well. They began to rot despite her efforts, turning gray-green and soft, the smell becoming unbearable. She had wept over those failures, not because the work was difficult, but because she felt she was losing him again, losing him piece by piece to decomposition and time. But she learned. She learned that salt was essential, that the skin needed to be cleaned of all fat and tissue, scraped thin and smooth, that it needed to be stretched and dried slowly, not in direct sun, but in shade with good air circulation. She learned that alum helped set the preservation, that borax could prevent mold. She learned these things through trial and error, through nights spent hunched over her work, her hands stained and raw, her back aching, her eyes burning from the smoke of tallow candles. She returned to the cemetery 7 times over the course of 6 months, 7 exhumations. Each time, she took more. A patch from his back, a section from his chest, the skin from his arms. She worked methodically, carefully, trying not to damage what she took. She would arrive after midnight, when even the night birds had gone silent. She would dig with a shovel, and her bare hands when the shovel became too loud. She would open the coffin, and she would take what she needed, and then she would close it again, and refill the grave, and smooth the dirt, and walk home with her terrible harvest wrapped in cloth and hidden beneath her shawl. No one saw her, or if they did, they said nothing, because this was Oklahoma territory, and people had learned to mind their own business, to not ask questions about what their neighbors did in the dark hours, to assume that everyone had their reasons, their private griefs, their secret shames. And so, Eleanor's trips to the cemetery went unnoticed, or at least unremarked upon, until the morning a grave digger came to prepare a new plot and noticed that Samuel Briggs's grave looked disturbed, that the earth had been moved recently, that something was not right. He told the preacher told the sheriff, and the sheriff rode out to the cemetery and looked at the grave, and knew immediately that something terrible had happened. He had it exhumed officially, with witnesses and daylight, and all the proper procedures. And when they opened the coffin, they found Samuel's body. What was left of it. Large sections of skin were missing, cut away with precision. The body had been arranged carefully after each removal, positioned to hide the missing pieces from casual observation. But there was no hiding it now. Samuel Briggs had been defiled, desecrated, harvested. The sheriff did not need to ask who had done it. There was only one person who would have reason, only one person whose grief had been so absolute, so consuming, that it had twisted into something unrecognizable. He rode out to Eleanor's homestead that same day, but he did not go inside. Not yet. He stood outside the door and listened, and he heard singing, that hymn, and he knew what he would find inside. But knowing and seeing are different things, and what he saw when he finally entered that house would stay with him for the rest of his life. The dress was nearly complete by then. It hung on a dressmaker's form that Eleanor had fashioned from a wooden frame and burlap stuffing. The form was roughly the shape of a woman, of Eleanor herself, and the dress fitted perfectly. The bodice was fitted and boned. The sleeves were long and slightly gathered at the shoulder. The skirt was full, with a modest train. It looked from a distance like a beautiful wedding dress, cream-colored and elegant, but up close, you could see what it was made from. The texture was wrong, the surface mottled and uneven. The seams were thick and raised, and in places, you could still see the individual characteristics. A scar on what had been Samuel's forearm, a mole on what had been his shoulder blade. a patch of chest hair that Eleanor had carefully preserved and incorporated into the bodice like some grotesque embroidery. She had been working on the veil when they found her. The veil was to be made from the skin of Samuel's face, his forehead, his cheeks, his throat. The pieces were stretched thin, almost translucent, laid out on the table in a pattern she had drawn on paper. She had not yet stitched them together. She was still planning, still perfecting. She wanted it to be perfect, because it was for their anniversary, because she was going to wear the dress on the day they had married, exactly 2 years after his death, because she believed, with a faith that was both beautiful and horrible, that if she wore him, if she wrapped herself in his skin, then they would be together again. Then the marriage would be complete. Then death would be defeated. The neighbors began to notice that something was wrong. Not just wrong in the way of grief, wrong in a deeper, more unsettling way. Eleanor stopped tending the garden. She stopped feeding the chickens. The animals wandered off or died. The house fell into disrepair. The windows went dark, and when people came to check on her, when they knocked on the door and called her name, they heard only silence, or sometimes, if they listened carefully, they heard singing, faint and distant and wrong. One of the neighbors, a woman named Hazel Crawford, tried to help. She was a practical woman, a mother of 4, a woman who believed that faith and hard work and common sense could solve most problems. She walked out to Eleanor's homestead on a cold morning in October, carrying a basket of bread and preserves. She knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. And then she heard it, that singing, coming from inside, low and rhythmic and wrong. Hazel pushed the door open. It was not locked. She stepped inside. The smell hit her first, a thick, sweet, rotting smell that made her stomach turn. The interior of the house was dim. The curtains were drawn. The air was close and stale, and in the center of the room, at the table, sat Eleanor. She was sewing. Her back was to the door. Her head was bowed. Her needle moved in and out of the fabric in her lap. In and out, in and out. And she was singing. Hazel took a step closer, and then she saw what Eleanor was sewing, and she screamed. Eleanor did not turn around. She did not stop. She just kept sewing, her needle moving steadily, her voice never faltering. Hazel stumbled backward, dropped the basket, and ran. She ran all the way back to town. She ran to the sheriff, and she told him what she had seen. And at first, he did not believe her. But the look on her face, the terror in her eyes, it was real, too real to ignore. The sheriff, a man named Thomas Pike, rode out to the Briggs homestead with 2 deputies. They arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was low and red, casting long shadows across the prairie. The house looked abandoned. The door stood open. The wind moved through it like breath through a corpse. Sheriff Pike dismounted. He called Eleanor's name. No answer. He drew his pistol, not because he expected danger, but because the place felt wrong, like walking into a tomb. He stepped inside. The smell was worse now, thick and cloying and inescapable. He covered his nose with his sleeve. He looked around. The house was a ruin, filthy, dark. The table was covered with scraps of something that looked like leather. No, not leather. He stepped closer, and then he saw it. The dress, hanging from a hook on the wall, and he understood. It was a wedding dress, or at least it had been made in the shape of one. The bodice was fitted. The sleeves were long. The skirt was full and flowing. But the fabric was not fabric. It was skin, human skin, stitched together in panels and seams, pale and mottled and wrong, and in places you could still see the marks, a scar, a mole, a patch of hair, pieces of a man Eleanor had loved, pieces of Samuel. Sheriff Pike staggered backward. He turned and vomited outside the door. His deputies stood frozen, staring at the dress, their faces white, and then they heard her. The singing, faint, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. They followed the sound, through the main room, into the small back room that served as a bedroom. And there she was. Eleanor was sitting on the bed. The wedding dress was draped across her lap. She was holding a needle and thread, and she was sewing the final seam. She looked up when the men entered. Her face was calm, almost serene. Her eyes were clear. She smiled, a small, distant smile, and she said, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away, that she was almost finished, that she would be ready soon, that Samuel was waiting. They took her into custody that night. She did not resist. She came quietly, still carrying the dress. She held it carefully, like it was the most precious thing in the world. They took her to the county jail in Guthrie. They locked her in a cell, and they sent for a doctor. Not a medical doctor, a doctor of the mind, because everyone agreed that Eleanor Briggs was not sane, that she had been broken by grief, that she needed help, but Eleanor did not see it that way. In the cell, she sat on the narrow cot and held the dress in her lap and stroked it gently, like you would stroke a child. She told the guards that she was not mad, that she had only done what any woman would do, that she had kept her promise, that she and Samuel would be together again, that death was not the end, that love was stronger, that she would wear the dress on their anniversary, that everything would be perfect. The trial was brief. There was no question of guilt. The evidence was irrefutable. The dress itself was entered as evidence, though the judge ordered it covered with a sheet, because the sight of it made the jury physically ill. Eleanor sat quietly through the proceedings, her hands folded in her lap, her face blank. She did not speak in her own defense. She did not plead. She simply waited. The verdict was not guilty by reason of insanity. She was remanded to the Oklahoma Territorial Asylum for the Insane, a grim brick building on the outskirts of Norman. She was taken there in chains. She did not cry. She did not fight. She just watched the prairie roll past the window of the wagon, her eyes distant, her lips moving silently, singing. The asylum was a place of last resort, a place where the broken and the lost were sent to be forgotten. The halls were long and narrow and dimly lit. The rooms were small and cold. The patients wandered like ghosts, murmuring to themselves, lost in worlds that only they could see. Eleanor was given a room on the second floor, a narrow bed, a small window with bars, a chamber pot, nothing else. She was a model patient at first, quiet, compliant. She ate what they gave her. She did what she was told, but she did not speak. She did not interact with the other patients. She just sat on her bed and stared at the wall. And at night, when the asylum went quiet, the guards heard her singing that same hymn over and over, like a prayer. The Oklahoma Territorial Asylum for the Insane was a place built on good intentions and limited resources. It had opened only 3 years before Eleanor's arrival, a brick fortress on the outskirts of Norman designed to house those whom society could not or would not accommodate. The building was imposing from the outside, with its turrets and iron-barred windows, but inside it was a warren of narrow corridors and cramped cells that smelled of carbolic acid and human despair. The staff was overworked and underpaid. The treatments were experimental at best, harmful at worst, but it was the only option for people like Eleanor, people whose minds had broken in ways that made them dangerous to themselves or others. Dr. Marcus Wendell was the physician assigned to Eleanor's case. He was a young man, recently graduated from medical school in Philadelphia, full of progressive ideas about mental illness and its treatment. He believed that madness was not demonic possession or moral failure, but a disease of the brain that could potentially be cured with the right intervention. He interviewed Eleanor extensively in her first weeks at the asylum, trying to understand the nature of her affliction, the root of her delusion. But Eleanor did not cooperate. She answered his questions with silence or with statements that made no sense. When he asked her why she had taken her husband's skin, she looked at him with those calm, distant eyes and said that she had not taken it, that he had given it to her, that it was a gift, a way for them to be together. When he asked if she understood that Samuel was dead, she smiled, a small, sad smile, and she said that death was just a word, that Samuel was more alive now than he had ever been, that she could feel him with her always, that soon, very soon, they would be together again. Dr. Wendell wrote in his notes that Eleanor Briggs was suffering from a severe delusional disorder brought on by traumatic grief, that she had constructed an elaborate fantasy to avoid confronting the reality of her loss, that she was, in his professional opinion, unlikely to recover without significant intervention. He prescribed a regimen of cold baths and enforced rest. He tried various medications available at the time, laudanum to calm her, bromides to help her sleep, tonics meant to strengthen the nerves. Nothing worked. Eleanor remained locked in her delusion, unreachable, lost. The other patients were afraid of her, not because she was violent, she never was, but because of the way she looked at people, through them, as if she were seeing something else, something beyond. One patient, a woman named Mary who had been committed for melancholia, reported that Eleanor had approached her once in the common room, had reached out and touched her arm, and had said very quietly that skin was beautiful, that it held everything, memory and love and the shape of a life, that when you touched someone's skin, you were touching their soul. Mary had screamed. The orderlies had come running, but Eleanor had simply smiled and returned to her corner, humming that hymn. There were incidents, small ones at first. Eleanor was found one morning with scratches on her arms, self-inflicted, shallow cuts that she had made with a broken button. When asked why, she said she was practicing, that she needed to understand the resistance of skin, the way it split under pressure. The orderlies took away anything she could use to harm herself, but she found ways. A splinter from the window frame, a sharp edge on the bed frame. She was not trying to kill herself. She was trying to learn, to understand, to prepare for the day when she would be reunited with Samuel and would need to know these things. Dr. Wendell wrote to colleagues asking for advice. He received responses suggesting more extreme measures, hydrotherapy, isolation, even the new and controversial treatment of surgical intervention. But he hesitated. There was something about Eleanor that gave him pause. She was mad, yes, but she was also somehow lucid within her madness. Her delusion was complete and self-contained. She was not raving. She was not incoherent. She simply existed in a reality that was parallel to the one everyone else inhabited. And while her actions were horrifying, there was a strange logic to them, a terrible, beautiful logic that made him wonder in his darker moments if perhaps she was not entirely wrong, if perhaps love could transcend death in ways that rational minds could not comprehend. But he was a man of science, a man of reason, and so he continued his treatments and made his notes, and watched Eleanor Briggs slowly fade away. Months passed, then a year. Eleanor did not improve. If anything, she retreated further into herself. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. Her skin grew pale and drawn. Her eyes sunk deep into her skull. She looked like a corpse herself, like she was slowly transforming into the thing she had loved. The doctors tried force-feeding, they tried isolation, they tried everything. But Eleanor had made her choice. She was going to join Samuel, and nothing they did could stop her. The night staff reported strange occurrences in Eleanor's room. Cold spots, the smell of flowers where there should be none, the sound of two voices singing, not one. A guard named James Holloway swore he saw a figure standing beside Eleanor's bed one night when he did his rounds. A man's figure, tall and broad-shouldered, but when he blinked and looked again, there was nothing. Just Eleanor, lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling, her lips moving silently. Dr. Wendell documented these reports with skepticism. He was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in ghosts or hauntings, but he could not deny that there was something wrong with Eleanor's room, something that made even the most hardened orderlies reluctant to enter, an atmosphere, a presence, as if the space itself had been contaminated by her obsession. Months passed, then a year. Eleanor did not improve. If anything, she retreated further into herself. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. Her skin grew pale and drawn. Her eyes sunk deep into her skull. She looked like a corpse herself, like she was slowly transforming into the thing she had loved. The doctors tried everything. Laudanum, cold baths, isolation. Nothing worked. Eleanor was unreachable, lost in a place where no one could follow. And then, on a cold night in February of 1899, Eleanor Briggs died. She was found in her bed, her eyes open, her face calm. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the night guard, a man named James Holloway, told a different story. He said he had heard singing that night, louder than usual, and then it had stopped, suddenly, like a candle being snuffed out. He had gone to check on her, and when he opened the door, he saw her lying on the bed, dead, and beside her, spread across the blanket like a shroud, was the wedding dress, the dress made from Samuel's skin. But that was impossible. The dress had been destroyed after the trial, burned in the furnace at the county courthouse. Dozens of people had witnessed it, and yet there it was, or something that looked like it. The guard swore he saw it, but when the doctors came, the dress was gone. There was nothing on the bed but Eleanor's body and a thin, gray blanket. The guard was accused of hysteria, of being drunk, of seeing things that were not there, but he never changed his story. He said he saw it, and he believed, until the day he died, that Eleanor had somehow brought it back, that her will was so strong, even death could not keep them apart. Eleanor was buried in the asylum cemetery, a small plot of land behind the building, marked with simple wooden crosses. No name, just a number. She was number 73. The grave was shallow. The ceremony was brief. 2 attendants with shovels, a chaplain who spoke a few words, and then it was over. The earth was piled on top of the pine box, and Eleanor Briggs, the woman who had loved so fiercely she had crossed the boundaries of sanity and decency, was gone. But the story did not end there. Stories like this never do. The house on the Cimarron remained empty for years. No one would buy it. No one would even step foot on the property. The land was allowed to go fallow. The house slowly collapsed in on itself, the sod walls melting back into the earth, the roof caving in, the windows broken by wind and time. And people said it was haunted, that on certain nights, when the wind was right, you could hear singing, that same hymn, slow and tuneless and wrong. And they said that if you were foolish enough to go inside, if you were curious enough to dig through the rubble and the rot, you might find something hidden in the ruins, something wrapped in cloth, something that looked like fabric but felt like skin, something that should have been destroyed but refused to stay gone. The locals avoided the place. Parents told their children to stay away. Travelers on the road gave the property a wide berth, and over time, the story became a legend. A cautionary tale about the dangers of love twisted into obsession, about grief that refuses to let go, about the thin line between devotion and madness. But here is the thing about legends. They are built on truth, and the truth is this. Eleanor Briggs loved her husband with a love that transcended death, that defied it, that refused to accept it. And in her refusal, she became something other than human, something monstrous, not because she was evil, but because she loved too much, because she could not let go, because she believed, with a certainty that bordered on the divine, that love was the only thing that mattered, that it could conquer anything, even the grave. And maybe she was right. Maybe love is stronger than death. Maybe it does endure beyond the boundaries of flesh and time. But the question remains, at what cost? What do we become when we refuse to accept the natural order? When we try to hold on to what we have lost? When we stitch together the pieces of the dead and call it devotion? Eleanor believed she was honoring Samuel, that she was keeping him with her. But what she created was not a memorial. It was a perversion, a violation of the sacred boundary between the living and the dead. She took something beautiful, a marriage, a love story, and she twisted it into something grotesque. She became a monster, not because she wanted to, but because she could not see any other way. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying part of the story. Not the dress itself, not the act of desecration, but the fact that Eleanor never saw herself as a monster. She saw herself as a wife, as a woman keeping a promise, as someone who loved so deeply that nothing, not even death, could make her let go. The question the story asks us, the question that lingers long after the facts have been laid out and examined, is this: where is the line? Where does love end and madness begin? How much of ourselves are we willing to sacrifice on the altar of devotion? And if we cross that line, if we step into the darkness, can we ever find our way back? There are no easy answers. There never are. But the story of Eleanor Briggs forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that love, in its purest and most unfiltered form, can be as destructive as it is beautiful. That the same force that binds us together can also tear us apart. That the human heart, when broken beyond repair, is capable of terrible things. The old-timers in Oklahoma still tell the story sometimes. Late at night, when the fire is low and the children are asleep, they tell it in hushed voices, like a secret, too dark to say out loud. They talk about the widow who sewed her husband's skin into her wedding dress, about the house on the Cimarron where the wind still sings, about the grave in the asylum cemetery where something rests that should not have been allowed to rest at all. And they say that if you listen closely, on certain nights when the moon is dark and the air is still, you can hear her singing that hymn, the one from their wedding, slow and tuneless and wrong, a love song that became a dirge, a prayer that became a curse, because some promises should never be kept, some loves should never be tested, and some lines should never be crossed. But Eleanor Briggs crossed them all, and in doing so, she became a ghost herself, a legend whispered in the dark, a warning written in skin and thread. The frontier has always been a place of extremes, of life and death, of hope and despair, of beauty and horror. And the people who came here, who carved out lives from this harsh and unforgiving land, they knew that survival required sacrifice, that the land would test you, that it would break you if you were not strong enough. But Eleanor's story is different. She was not broken by the land. She was broken by love. And that is a far more terrible thing, because the land you can fight, you can work it, You can tame it, but love does not respond to will or effort. It does not follow logic or reason. It simply is. And when it turns inward, when it becomes obsession, when it refuses to accept loss, it can consume you more completely than any fire, any drought, any storm. It can hollow you out and leave you a shell, a ghost walking, a thing that looks human but has forgotten what it means to be human. Eleanor forgot, or maybe she never knew. Maybe the capacity for that kind of obsession was always inside her, waiting for the right circumstances to bloom. Maybe Samuel's death was just the catalyst, the spark that ignited something that had always been there, a darkness dressed up as devotion. There is a photograph, one photograph, taken before any of this happened, before Samuel died, before Eleanor became the widow. It shows them standing in front of their sod house, squinting into the sun. Samuel's arm is around Eleanor's shoulders. She is leaning into him slightly. They are not smiling, because people did not smile in photographs back then. But there is something in their faces, a softness, a contentment. They look like two people who have found what they were looking for, who are exactly where they want to be. The photograph survived. It was found among Eleanor's possessions after she was committed. It is kept now in the archives of the Oklahoma Historical Society. If you wanted, you could go there and ask to see it. You could hold it in your hands and look at their faces and try to imagine what they were thinking in that moment, what they hoped for, what they dreamed. And you could see, with your own eyes, that they were just people, ordinary people, no different from you or me. But something happened to Eleanor after that photograph was taken. Something inside her shifted, or broke, or transformed. And the woman who stood in that photograph, who leaned into her husband with trust and love, became someone else entirely. Someone who could not let go. Someone who would rather commit an unspeakable act than live in a world without him. Was it grief? Was it madness? Was it love? Maybe it was all three. Maybe they are not as separate as we like to think. Maybe grief is a kind of madness. Maybe love, when taken to its extreme, becomes indistinguishable from obsession. Maybe the human mind, when confronted with unbearable loss, simply breaks in whatever way allows it to continue. Eleanor's mind broke toward Samuel, toward holding on, toward refusing the reality of his death. And in that breaking, she created something that should never have existed, a wedding dress made from the skin of her dead husband, a garment that was both a monument to love and a testament to horror, a thing that exists in the space between devotion and desecration, between the sacred and the profane. The dress itself, or what remained of it, was destroyed, but the idea of it persists, the image of it, the wrongness of it. It lives in the imagination now, more than it ever lived in reality, and that, perhaps, is its true power. Not what it was, but what it represents, the lengths to which grief can drive us, the depths to which love can sink, the terrible, beautiful, monstrous things we are capable of when we love something too much to let it go. In the years after Eleanor's death, a few scholars and journalists tried to investigate her story. They went through court records, asylum files, testimonies. They interviewed the few people who had known her, and what they found was a woman who, by all accounts, had been normal, sane, devoted, but not obsessed. A woman who had done nothing to suggest that she was capable of what she eventually did. But then Samuel died, and everything changed. And the question they kept coming back to was, why? What was it about Samuel's death that pushed Eleanor over the edge? Was it the suddenness? The unfairness? The fact that they had barely begun their life together? Or was it something deeper? something in Eleanor herself, a wound that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to open. No one knows. No one can know, because Eleanor never explained herself. Not to the sheriff, not to the doctors, not to anyone. She simply did what she did, and when they asked her why, she looked at them with those calm, distant eyes and said only that she loved him, that she had promised, that she would not break her promise, and that was all. It is tempting to dismiss her as mad, to say that grief broke her mind and made her into something she was not. But the uncomfortable truth is that Eleanor was, in her own twisted way, entirely rational. She had a goal. She had a plan. She executed that plan with care and precision. She was not raving. She was not violent. She was simply determined to keep Samuel with her, determined to honor their marriage in the only way she could imagine. And that determination, that clarity of purpose, is what makes the story so disturbing. Because it forces us to acknowledge that the line between sanity and madness is not as clear as we would like it to be, that people can do monstrous things for reasons that make perfect sense to them, that love, in its most extreme form, can look an awful lot like insanity. The house on the Cimarron is gone now. The land has been reclaimed by the prairie. The creek still runs nearby when there is rain. The cottonwoods still stand. But there is no trace of Eleanor or Samuel or the life they tried to build. It is as if they were never there, as if the land itself has forgotten them. But the people have not forgotten. The story has been passed down through generations. It has been told and retold, embellished and distorted, until it has become part of the fabric of Oklahoma folklore. A ghost story, a cautionary tale, a reminder that the frontier was not just a place of physical danger. It was also a place where the boundaries of the self could dissolve, where isolation and hardship could strip away the layers of civilization and reveal something raw and primal beneath. And Eleanor Briggs, the widow who sewed her husband's skin into her wedding dress, has become a symbol of that dissolution, a figure who represents the danger of loving too much, of holding on too tight, of refusing to accept that some things, once lost, can never be reclaimed. There is a poem written by an anonymous author sometime in the early 1900s that captures the essence of Eleanor's story. It goes like this. She wore him like a veil of grief, stitched tight with trembling hands. She walked the earth a hollow bride, bound by blood and broken bands. She sang the hymns of sacred vows, but every note was stained with sin. For love that cannot loose its grasp will flay the flesh and wear the skin. The poem was found written on a scrap of paper, tucked into the margins of a Bible in a Guthrie church. No one knows who wrote it, but it has endured, like the story itself, like the memory of Eleanor, like the idea that love, when it refuses to let go, can become something monstrous. And that is the final lesson of Eleanor Briggs, that love is not always enough, that devotion, taken to its extreme, can destroy as thoroughly as hate, that the human heart, when broken, can create horrors that rival anything in nature, that we are all, every one of us, capable of crossing lines we never imagined we would cross. All it takes is the right circumstances, the right loss, the right wound. Eleanor crossed that line, and in doing so, she became something other than human, not a ghost, not a monster, but something in between, a woman who loved so much that she ceased to be a woman at all, who became instead a warning, a whisper in the dark, a story told to frighten children and remind adults that the frontier, the real frontier, is not out there in the wilderness. It is inside us, in the wild, untamed spaces of the human heart. And on certain nights, When the wind moves across the Oklahoma prairie, when the moon hangs low and the air is still, you can hear it, a voice, singing, a hymn that should be beautiful but is not, a love song that has curdled into something else, something wrong, something that should have been buried but refuses to stay down. And you know, without knowing how you know, that it is her, Eleanor, still singing, still waiting, still holding on to a love that should have let her go a long time ago, still believing, with a faith that borders on the divine, that if she just holds on long enough, if she just refuses to accept the truth, then Samuel will come back to her, that they will be together again, that the dress will finally be worn, that the wedding will finally be complete. But the wedding will never be complete because Samuel is gone, and Eleanor, in trying to keep him, lost herself. And the dress, that terrible, beautiful, monstrous dress, is nothing but a symbol now. A symbol of what happens when we love too much, when we refuse to grieve, when we try to hold on to what we have lost, no matter the cost. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some boundaries exist for a reason, and the boundary between the living and the dead is the most sacred of all. Eleanor Briggs crossed it, and in doing so, she became a ghost herself, not in the literal sense, but in the sense that she ceased to exist as a person, and became instead a story, a legend, a warning whispered in the dark, the widow who sewed her husband's skin into her wedding dress, the woman who loved so much she became a monster, the bride who wore death like a veil and sang hymns to the empty air. That is who Eleanor Briggs is now. That is all she will ever be, a name, a story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of loving too much and letting go too little. And if you ever find yourself on the Oklahoma prairie, driving down a dusty road late at night, and you hear singing on the wind, faint and distant and wrong, do not stop. Do not investigate. Do not try to find the source, because some things should stay buried, some stories should remain unfinished, and some loves should never be tested. Just keep driving. Keep your eyes on the road, and remember that the frontier is not a place. It is a state of mind, a space where the rules do not apply, where love and madness are two sides of the same coin, where a woman can sew her husband's skin into her wedding dress and call it devotion. Remember Eleanor Briggs. Remember her love. Remember her loss. Remember her descent into something that should never have existed. And remember that we are all, every one of us, just one tragedy away from crossing the same line, just one loss away from becoming the very thing we fear. The wind carries many things in Oklahoma: dust, whispers, prayers, but on certain nights it also carries a song, a hymn, a love song that has become a dirge. And if you listen closely, you can hear the words, faint and broken and wrong. A promise that should never have been made, a vow that should never have been kept, till death do us part. That is what Eleanor promised. That is what she swore before God and witnesses. But death did not part them, not in the way it should have, because Eleanor refused. She stitched them back together with needle and thread, and a love so fierce it transcended sanity. And in doing so, she created something that will never die. Not truly, because stories like this do not die. They linger, they haunt, they become part of the landscape, woven into the fabric of the place like blood into cloth, the cursed frontier. That is what they call it now. The place where the rules do not apply, where love can become horror, where the dead do not always stay buried. And Eleanor Briggs, the widow who wore her husband's skin, is its patron saint, its queen, its warning. So remember her story. And remember that some promises should never be kept, some loves should never be tested, and some lines should never ever be crossed. Because once you cross them, there is no going back. There is only the wind, and the singing, and the terrible, beautiful, monstrous thing you have become. The frontier is closed now. Oklahoma is a state. The land has been tamed. The wilderness has been pushed back, but the stories remain, and they remind us that the true frontier was never out there. It was always inside us, in the wild, untamed spaces of the human heart, where love and madness live side by side, where devotion can become obsession, where a woman can take the skin of her dead husband and sew it into a wedding dress and believe with absolute certainty that she is doing the right thing. That is the story of Eleanor Briggs, the widow of Oklahoma, the woman who loved too much, the bride who wore death. And it is a story that will never end, because it is not just her story, it is ours. It is the story of what we are capable of when we love too much and let go too little, when we refuse to accept loss, when we try to hold on to what should have been released. And that is why the story endures, not because it is sensational, not because it is shocking, but because it is true, not literally, perhaps, but emotionally, spiritually. It is true in the way that all great horror stories are true, because it shows us something about ourselves that we would rather not see, something dark and raw and real, something that reminds us that we are not as civilized as we like to think, that beneath the surface, beneath the rules and the rituals and the social contracts, we are still wild, still capable of terrible things, still willing to cross any line if the circumstances are right. Eleanor Briggs crossed that line, and she became a legend, a ghost, a warning, and her story will be told as long as there are people to tell it, as long as there are those who understand that love, in its purest and most unfiltered form, can be as destructive as it is beautiful, that the frontier, the real frontier, is not a place on a map. It is the space between devotion and madness, between life and death, between the human and the monstrous. And Eleanor Briggs lives there still, in that space, in that story, singing her hymn, wearing her dress, waiting for a reunion that will never come, holding on to a love that should have let her go, a bride, a widow, a ghost, a warning, a woman who loved too much and paid the price and became something that will never be forgotten, something that will haunt the Oklahoma prairie for as long as the wind blows and the stories are told. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed, and Eleanor Briggs crossed them all.